Welcome to today's segment of What's Philosophy, or actually history of ancient philosophy. We will be talking at the beginning about what is philosophy. I just want to start off by recapping what we did last time, and then we're going to be moving on to looking at the central questions of philosophy. That is, I'm going to try speaking English. What are the central questions of philosophy? Just wanted to remind you where we ended up last time. We were talking about the central figures of ancient philosophy that we'll be discussing. Pre-philosophy, Hesiod, Homer. Most of you are familiar with Homer. Some of you at least are familiar with Homer. Maybe the movies about Homer. You know, Troy, the Odyssey, the Iliad, excuse me. It was his other book, the Odyssey, the mythology. Then we're going to be, the next set of people that we're going to be examining a little bit, not spending a lot of time on them, are what are called the pre-Socratic philosophers. And pre-Socratic is a term that comes from before Socrates. And actually, Anaxagoras was a contemporary of Socrates, but I guess they classify him as a pre-Socratic philosopher in that he had more in common with the philosophers that came before Socrates than he did with Socrates and his successors. And among these, we had seen the Carl Sagan video from Cosmos, and we heard about Thales and Anaximander and Anaximenes, the Milesians. They were from Miletus in Turkey, which was a Greek colony at that point. We'll then probably mention in passing, not really spend any time with Pythagoras, you know, the guy who... There's a very famous theorem named after him, the Pythagorean theorem. That is, the square of the hypotenuse of a triangle is equal to the sum of the squares of its two sides. Very interesting discovery in math. No, you don't have to know that for this course. We will spend a little time with Heraclitus. And the reason that we're doing this is to kind of give you an idea of where Socrates and Plato mentally are coming from. That is, what is it that stimulated their ideas? Where did they get their ideas from, or what was it that they were trying to respond to? Heraclitus is a key figure in that. The Milesians were telling him what's the nature of the universe. What is the founding principle? And it was a material principle. Heraclitus comes along and he's going to tell them, no, it's not a material principle. Matter is always changing. Everything is the universe, and the universe is changing. Fire is the essential element, and fire is the essential element because everything is always changing. And excuse me, I just noticed that should say Heraclitus, Heraclitus, typo. I will correct that in the slide. Now, everything according to Heraclitus is changing. It's in a state of flux. You can't, there is no truth because truth is constantly changing. Comes along Parmenides and says, wait a second, you guys have the wrong attitude. And I should mention, he doesn't say this so clearly because Parmenides, or at least what we have from Parmenides, is written as a poem, so it takes quite a bit to figure it out. And as we go through it, we're going to see how difficult that is, but I'm going to help you through that one because I think it is very, very tough. But Parmenides comes up with a very strange theory, and he has an argument for it, that everything that exists is part of a unity. It's part of one. And all the things that we're looking at that Heraclitus is relying on, is referring to, that everything is changing, those things aren't real. What we see, what we hear, what we smell, what we taste, that is not real. That's not reality. And then his student, Zeno, comes along, and Zeno takes the position of defending his teacher's positions, and he does this by coming to some very, very, very odd conclusions. Many of you think you came into the room you're in. The time has passed. That you covered some space getting into wherever it is that you're listening to this video, and not on cyberspace. Zeno has a series of arguments known as Zeno's paradoxes. And Zeno's paradoxes are intended to show that Motion is impossible. The passage of time is impossible. And the concept of space is an impossible concept. Very strange conclusions, but nonetheless, Plato, or in his dialogues, takes Parmenides, very seriously. He seems to have affected Socrates and Plato's views, and in fact, Plato has so much respect for Parmenides that while normally what Plato writes are dialogues, and many of them, maybe the majority of them, has Socrates, his teacher, as the central character, except the one time where he's beginning to change his theory, something called his theory of forms. We might or might not mention that in class, but it's a significant part of his philosophy, and the main character in that dialogue who points out the problems with Plato's theory of forms is Parmenides. Then, subsequent to that, in time, historically, the atomists came along, and Anaxagoras had something in common with the atomists later on. Now, it's not that these guys understood that there were protons, neutrons, and electrons, or really had something like our current atomic theory was developed 2,500 years later, but rather they thought that matter was the central part of the universe, that there were little particles of matter, atoms that made everything up. And Anaxagoras' views, ones that we won't touch for this semester, but he had some interesting, maybe from a metaphysical or scientific perspective. Well, that kind of shapes the intellectual world for Socrates. Socrates thinks that you can know things. Socrates focuses on virtues, on ethics, on the right way to live, but he does concern himself with trying to figure out which of his predecessors was right, or which were right, what parts of them are right, what parts of them are wrong, and we'll be looking at Socrates through the dialogues of Plato. Socrates either he didn't write anything or nothing that he's written has survived. What we know about Socrates is through other authors, and mainly for our course, we'll be seeing what we learned through him, about him through the characterization in the dialogues of the next one, who is his student, Plato. Plato, just to remind you, starts out, the views that what they call the scholars call the early dialogues, starts out defending views that the scholars attribute to Socrates. Then there are the middle dialogues where Plato parts company with his teacher and gives his own doctrine, and finally there are his later dialogues, and in the later dialogues, Plato reacts to some of the problems that he's found in his earlier dialogues. Now, the evolution of Greek philosophy then moves on to Plato's student Aristotle, who's very famous for his own student. Was not a great student of philosophy, was a great figure in history. Probably the greatest Greek figure in history. Did you guess what it is? Who it is, I mean? Alexander the great general, the Greek king who conquered the world, made the Greek Empire, extended the Greek Empire. Now, after Aristotle, there were views espoused by Epicurus in his school. Later, there were the Stoics, and the Romans, as they did with much of Greek culture, inherited its philosophy and further developed. We'll be reading some of the stuff that those guys have to say. Now, I just wanted to, so if I can get to the next slide. Today we're going to be moving on to the central questions of philosophy. That is, the questions that philosophers are interested in finding general answers to. And we find that they're related to three very general topics, or I at least said that they are. Value. There are questions of value. How do we evaluate things in the world? How do we evaluate people's actions? How do we evaluate people, for that matter? What should I do? And we'll talk about some of the questions coming under values. Is something beautiful? Is it not? Say a little bit more about it. The next question is, and it's related, because in answering questions of value, you have to make some sort of claims about reality, what reality is, what really exists. And kind of on the flip side of what really exists, maybe that's what science tells us, we're going to be, or we need to look at what knowledge is. That is, how do we know things? Can we know things? What of reality can we know? What of value can we know? And finally, as I said last time, we have a unique tool in philosophy that is logic. And we'll be looking at logic a little bit, trying to understand how logic helps philosophers come to the answers to the questions that they give. Now, just to drill down a little bit more, and I still haven't fixed the slide, the first set of questions and central questions of philosophy we are going to be looking at come under value. And the goal is not to give you the answers. The goal of philosophy isn't to give you answers, to help you find answers. But what my goal today is to get you to understand what the central questions of philosophy are. And under the topic of value, there are really two sets of questions. One has to do with ethics, the evaluation. What is the value of people, their actions, the consequences of their actions? What's good? What's evil? Right? Wrong? What makes a man just or unjust? A good guy, a bad guy, the guys that wear the white hats, the guys that wear the black hats. And under ethics, or a branch of ethics, although some people say it's the exact, I've got the relationship backwards with ethics, is political philosophy. The questions there are, what is the proper form of government, or is there any proper form of government? What rights does society have? What do you owe society? What does society owe you? We'll talk a little bit more about those questions. And then there's in the area of value, another question is having to do with aesthetics. You go to a museum, you're wondering, why does somebody think this is a work of art? This is beautiful. When you look at some of my slides, when you look at the home page for the course on Blackboard, I have a picture of a Rodin statue. Why is that a beautiful statue? So these are questions of value. How do you what value do you put on things? And as I said, in answering some of these, and we're first going to be looking at ethics, answering some of these, we're going to have to find some answers to reality, the main topic under that, metaphysics, cosmology, ontology. These are words you probably know nothing about. We'll explain them later on today. And then we'll be looking at the problems of knowledge, the theory of knowledge, which philosophers have a term for, which I call epistemology, from the Greek episteme, knowledge. We'll talk a little bit about more about that later on. That's where we've been today. This is where we're going, and we're going to talk about what these questions actually are.